The small cafe was bathed in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun. Wooden tables reflected the light softly, and the air carried the familiar aroma of roasted coffee beans. People moved around, chatting in low tones, some working on laptops, others leaning back with a cup of tea, lost in their own thoughts. In one quiet corner, a young woman sat at an upright piano, her fingers gently resting on the keys. She didn't draw attention to herself. Her presence was calm and unassuming, just like the rest of the cafe. But there was a quiet intensity in her eyes. The young woman had come to the city only a few months ago, carrying a worn leather bag filled with sheet music, notebooks, and the small essentials she had gathered in her travels. She had been playing the piano since she could remember, her life woven with melodies that had been her constant companions. Music had always been more than a skill for her. It was a language she understood fully, one she could speak without words. Yet despite her deep connection with music, she had never sought the spotlight. She played in small spaces, sometimes for strangers, sometimes for herself, always quietly. As she adjusted her posture at the piano, a man approached her table. He was in his 40s with a gentle but businesslike air, and carried a clipboard with papers fluttering in the breeze from the open window. He looked at her for a moment, then smiled politely. "Excuse me," he said. "We're having an event here tonight, a small gathering for our regular patrons. Would you be willing to play a simple melody for them?" The young woman nodded without hesitation. She didn't speak much, not because she was shy, but because she preferred to listen first. Words often distracted her from feeling the space around her, and she liked to understand the room, the people, and the mood before letting music fill it. The man smiled again, apparently satisfied, and moved on to speak with other staff, leaving her alone with the piano. No one around her noticed the small exchange. Conversations continued. Laughter echoed softly, and the occasional clatter of cups against saucers filled the background. Some customers glanced at her occasionally, curious about the person at the piano, but most returned to their own world, assuming she would play something simple and unremarkable, just as requested. She closed her eyes briefly and let her hands hover above the keys. The request for a simple melody was clear, but she had a sense of the room, the people, and the stories hidden in their faces. Music, she thought, could be more than just background sound. It could reach the unseen, the unspoken. It could touch something deep inside, even if only for a moment. She breathed in slowly, letting the gentle rhythm of the cafe become part of her own rhythm. As she began to play, the first notes were soft, almost shy, as if testing the waters. They were simple, straightforward, following the lines of the melody requested. Yet there was a subtle richness to the sound, a warmth that seemed to settle around the room like a soft blanket. People glanced up, sensing something different. It wasn't just background music. There was a quiet emotion in each note, a thoughtfulness that drew them in. A few tables away, an older man set down his coffee and leaned forward slightly. He wasn't a musician, not by any formal training, but he had always loved music. He could feel the change in the air, the gentle pull of the notes reaching out. Even the barista wiping the counter paused for a moment, tilting her head as if listening more closely. There was a sense that something was beginning, a small shift that was almost imperceptible but undeniable. The young woman's fingers moved gracefully across the keys, each motion deliberate yet effortless. She was fully present, listening to the sounds she was creating and how they resonated with the room. She didn't rush, didn't push the notes, but allowed them to unfold naturally, like a conversation between her and the piano. There was a quiet confidence in the way she played, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that earned it slowly, gently, almost without anyone realizing it. People started to notice more clearly. A young man typing on his laptop paused, resting his fingers on the keys of his own keyboard for a moment, almost unconsciously following the rhythm. A woman in the corner reading a thick novel lowered the book slightly, letting her eyes drift toward the piano. Even a child sitting with a parent turned their head, curious about the sound, their small face lighting up with wonder. There was an unspoken agreement in the room, a collective pause, as if everyone was holding their breath to hear what would come next. The melody, still simple in its beginnings, began to take on subtle flourishes. She added gentle arpeggios that weren't loud or overwhelming, but added a delicate texture, like tiny ripples on a calm pond. Each note seemed to have its own space, yet they all connected, forming a pattern that felt both familiar and new. It was a simple melody, yes, but already there was something more. Something quietly extraordinary, weaving itself into the air. The young woman didn't look at the audience, didn't seek approval or reaction. Her eyes were focused on the keys, on the connection between thought and sound. But the energy in the room was changing. The cafe felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as if the music were knitting everyone together for just a few minutes. Strangers shared a fleeting moment of connection, united by something beyond words. As she continued, a few more people turned to listen, drawn by curiosity at first, and then by genuine engagement. Conversations had stopped completely, and even the barista leaned against the counter, her hands still wet from washing cups, listening. It was as if the simple request had opened a door, allowing something unseen to slip through. Music, she knew, had the power to do that. It could reach beneath the surface, touch the heart, and remind people of feelings they had almost forgotten. She played with a quiet joy, letting the melody breathe and expand naturally. There were no sudden jumps, no showy displays, but a steady unfolding that seemed to tell a story without words. Each note was chosen carefully, not for technical display, but for its ability to communicate, to resonate with those who were listening. The simplicity of the original request gave her freedom, not limitation. She could explore, express, and invite others into a world made entirely of sound. As the first part of the melody came to a gentle pause, she lifted her hands slightly, letting the last note linger in the air. There was a brief silence, the kind that makes people realize they have been holding their breath. Then quietly, without fanfare, the room began to exhale. Some people smiled, some nodded, some whispered to each other, acknowledging what they had just experienced. The young woman sat still for a moment, eyes closed, letting the energy of the room settle around her. She was aware of the small smiles, the curious glances, the gentle shift in the atmosphere. She didn't seek applause or recognition. That wasn't why she played. She played because music was a part of her, and in that cafe, with its warm sunlight and quiet hum of life, she had the chance to share a fragment of herself. Even if it was only for a few people, even if it was just a simple melody, it was enough to create a moment that mattered. As she prepared to continue, the young woman took a slow, steady breath. She felt the room, the people, and the possibilities that lay ahead in the unfolding music. The simple request had set the stage, but already she sensed that the story of this melody was only beginning. Something inside her stirred, a quiet excitement, a recognition that this moment, like so many before, could become something unforgettable. She returned her hands to the keys, ready to continue, ready to let the music speak even more deeply, ready to see where it might take her and the listeners who had, almost unknowingly, gathered to witness it. The young woman's fingers hovered over the keys once more, a quiet anticipation running through her. The room was still, almost as if the cafe itself were holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. She could hear the soft murmur of those who had paused their conversations, a gentle rustle of chairs and the quiet scraping of a spoon against a cup. It was a sound she had learned to appreciate over the years, a subtle reminder that people were listening, that her music could reach them even without words. As she pressed the keys again, the melody began to take shape in a way that felt natural, almost like breathing. The first notes were soft, delicate, careful not to startle anyone, yet they carried a depth that drew the listeners in. She didn't rush. There was no need. She allowed each note to hang in the air for a moment, letting it settle before moving to the next. Her mind was fully present, aware of every movement, every vibration of the piano, every response from the room. From the corner of the cafe, an older woman watched quietly. She had seen many performers, many musicians, but there was something different here. The young woman's playing was not about showing skill or impressing anyone. It was honest, sincere, a direct expression of feeling. The older woman's eyes softened as she listened, memories and emotions surfacing unexpectedly. Music had that power, she realized, to awaken things long forgotten, to touch parts of the soul that had been left untouched for years. The young woman began to add subtle variations to the melody. Gentle rises and falls, pauses that felt like breaths, tiny embellishments that made the simple tune richer without overwhelming it. Her hands moved with ease and confidence, yet every gesture was purposeful. She was telling a story not with words, but with the ebb and flow of sound, and the listeners, without even knowing it, were following along, caught in the gentle current she created. A young father, seated with his child, glanced down at the small boy, whose eyes were wide and bright. The child's hand rested lightly on the table, tapping in time with the music, and a soft smile appeared on his face. The father watched silently, feeling a rare moment of peace wash over him. He had been busy, caught up in work and errands, rarely slowing down to notice the small beauty in the world. But now, in this quiet cafe, a simple melody had reached him in a way he didn't expect. The music was not just sound. It was an invitation to pause, to feel, to remember. The young woman could sense these tiny reactions, though she did not look directly at anyone. She played with intention, allowing the story in her mind to unfold naturally. Each chord seemed to speak, each transition a gentle conversation between her and the room. There was no pressure to impress, no rush to reach some grand finale. The beauty was in the moment, in the connection that grew with every note. The sunlight streaming through the windows shifted slightly, casting a warmer glow across the polished wood of the piano. Dust particles floated lazily in the light, catching and scattering it like tiny sparks. It was a small, unnoticed detail, but somehow it felt significant, as if the entire room had become a living, breathing entity, responding to the music. The young woman felt a quiet thrill at this, a subtle acknowledgement that she was not alone in the creation of this moment. Music, she thought, was never truly solitary. It existed between people, in the shared space, in the unspoken understanding that passes quietly between them. Slowly, the melody began to evolve. She introduced a soft counterpoint, weaving a secondary line that danced gently with the main tune. It was intricate without being complicated, delicate but full of emotion. The cafe remained still, every ear attuned, every mind caught in the gentle web of sound. No one spoke, no one moved unnecessarily. It was as if the music had created a pause in the world outside, a bubble of quiet that sheltered them all. A group of students sitting near the back leaned forward, fascinated by the transformation. They had been talking about exams and plans for the evening, but all of that seemed distant now. The music was insistent in its quiet way, drawing them into a moment that belonged solely to the melody and the pianist. One of them whispered softly to the others, a simple acknowledgement. "Listen, really listen." The words hung in the air, almost swallowed by the music, but they carried truth. To really hear this performance, one had to let go of everything else. The young woman noticed a shift in her own feelings as she played. She had been nervous when first asked to perform, uncertain if a simple melody could hold anyone's attention, but now she felt a quiet joy, a sense of possibility. Music had a way of revealing unexpected paths, of transforming a simple request into something larger than anyone anticipated. She allowed herself to explore, to take small risks, to let the melody stretch and bend in ways that felt natural yet exciting. Her hands moved with subtle elegance, gliding across the keys as if they were extensions of her own emotions. There was a softness in her touch that invited the audience in, a gentle insistence that urged them to follow along, to notice the nuances, the quiet shifts, the spaces between the notes. She did not rush. Every pause, every lingering tone was part of the story she was telling. She wanted them to feel, not just hear. She wanted them to be present, to live in the moment with her. The cafe owner, who had been busy organizing tables and checking orders, finally allowed herself a moment to step back. She had heard many musicians in this space over the years, but there was something different here. The young woman's performance was subtle yet profound, like a conversation that spoke directly to the heart. The owner felt a shiver run through her as she watched patrons become quiet, attentive, absorbed in something she could barely describe. It was a rare gift, she realized, and one that deserved to be acknowledged. Outside, the wind whispered through the streets, carrying faint sounds of distant traffic and footsteps. Inside, none of that mattered. The music had created a separate world, one contained entirely within the warm walls of the cafe. Every person present felt it differently, yet all were united in its quiet power. The young woman could sense their emotions subtly, in the small movements, in the softening of their expressions, in the slow, gentle leaning forward as if to catch every detail. She introduced a slight change in tempo, a gentle acceleration that felt like a sigh. The melody lifted and dipped in a way that mirrored the invisible rhythms of the human heart. It was not dramatic, not showy, but profoundly affecting. People closed their eyes not to shut out the world but to better see inside themselves. Memories, hopes, and quiet longings surfaced, prompted by the tender, deliberate notes. It was a shared experience, intimate and personal at the same time. Even the barista, who had initially been distracted by tasks behind the counter, now stood still, listening. Her usual energy, the constant motion of serving drinks, faded for a moment as she allowed the music to fill her attention entirely. She felt a rare sense of calm, a temporary relief from the small worries and constant demands of her day. For a brief time, the young woman's playing became a bridge, connecting everyone in the cafe to something larger than themselves. The young woman played with a sense of fluidity that made the music feel alive. It shifted subtly, flowing in ways that seemed spontaneous yet were guided by her deep understanding of the instrument and the moment. She noticed, even without looking directly, the gentle nods, the attentive postures, the small, appreciative smiles. These were her reward, the quiet acknowledgement that she had reached them in a meaningful way. Time seemed to stretch and bend. What had begun as a simple melody now felt like a journey, unfolding naturally yet unexpectedly. The audience had become part of it, each listener adding their own silent response, their own private reflection, their own unspoken connection to the music. She felt this interplay, this shared creation, and it inspired her to continue exploring, to let the melody grow in ways she had not planned but welcomed. As the afternoon sunlight dimmed slightly, the young woman gently slowed the pace, allowing the music to settle once more. The final notes of this segment lingered in the air, soft and gentle, leaving an echo of warmth and emotion behind. The cafe remained silent for a heartbeat, each person savoring the lingering sensation of what they had just experienced. It was not an ending, merely a pause, a moment to breathe before the next part of the story unfolded. She lifted her hands, letting the last sound fade completely, and took a quiet breath. The audience did not immediately respond, caught in the spell of the moment, and she smiled softly, not needing applause or recognition. She had given them something, even if it was only fleeting, something that touched them in ways words could not. She knew that this was the power of music, the quiet magic that could transform the ordinary into something extraordinary. The young woman remained seated, hands still hovering, feeling the gentle energy of the room, the soft responses from each listener. The simple request for a melody had become a shared experience, a quiet miracle in the ordinary space of a cafe. She allowed herself a moment of gratitude, not for herself but for the gift of connection, the chance to touch lives without needing to be noticed, and the subtle joy of being fully present in a moment that mattered more than she could explain. As the young woman's hands hovered over the piano once again, a quiet anticipation settled over the room. The first part of her performance had already left its mark, and now she felt a deeper connection to the audience. Each person in the cafe was listening, not out of obligation but out of genuine curiosity. Their silence was a gift, a shared understanding that something important was about to happen, even if they did not yet know what. She pressed the first notes softly, allowing them to bloom naturally. The simple melody she had been asked to play began to transform as she let herself explore the space between the notes. Her fingers moved with gentle confidence, weaving small, intricate patterns that added richness without overpowering the original tune. It was as if the piano itself were responding to her touch, joining her in creating something alive and new. A young man sitting near the window shifted in his seat. He had been distracted when he first arrived, scrolling through messages on his phone, but now he was completely absorbed. His eyes followed the subtle movements of her hands, the graceful arcs she made as she transitioned from chord to chord. Something in the music spoke to him, stirring memories he had long pushed aside. He remembered afternoons spent with a loved one, the soft laughter of children, the quiet moments of reflection that seemed to disappear in the rush of daily life. The melody, simple yet profound, was reminding him of these moments, making them feel immediate and alive. The young woman's expression remained calm, her focus entirely on the keys. Yet within her a quiet excitement stirred. She had always known that music had power, but moments like this reminded her how potent it could be. She could feel the audience leaning in, catching every nuance, every subtle shift. The energy was delicate but undeniable, a shared rhythm that connected her to each listener without words. She let herself follow it, allowing the music to guide her, to take shapes she had not planned but welcomed. A mother with a small child in her lap found herself holding her breath, along with the gentle rises and falls of the melody. The child's eyes were wide with wonder, their tiny hand tapping lightly against the mother's arm, echoing the rhythm. The mother smiled softly, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. The day had been long, full of errands and responsibilities, but this moment was hers, theirs, a quiet escape. She realized that the music had a way of creating stillness, a pause in the endless motion of life. The melody began to change, still delicate but more intricate now. She introduced subtle variations that made the tune dance in unexpected ways. Arpeggios floated through the room like tiny streams, small flourishes that felt spontaneous yet perfectly placed. Every note was intentional, every pause a gentle breath. She could sense the subtle reactions in the room. A tilt of the head, a soft smile, a closed eye absorbing the sound fully. These small gestures told her more than words ever could. They were proof that the music was reaching them, touching them in ways that were silent but powerful. The sunlight outside shifted again, casting warmer hues across the wooden floor and the polished surface of the piano. Tiny motes of dust caught the light, dancing slowly in the beams, almost as if they were moving to the rhythm of the music. The young woman noticed this, a quiet smile touching her lips. There was something magical about ordinary things when music filled the air. The cafe, the sunlight, the people, all were part of a living, breathing moment that felt suspended in time. She allowed the melody to rise slightly, adding gentle crescendos that never felt overwhelming, but gave the tune a sense of movement and depth. It was as if the simple request had opened a door to a larger world, one that existed only in the space between the piano and the listeners. She could feel the emotions in the room subtly shifting, curiosity becoming awe, distraction turning into attention, casual interest blossoming into deep engagement. The music was no longer just a sound. It was a shared experience, a quiet conversation that needed no words. A group of young women at a nearby table leaned forward, intrigued by the unexpected complexity of the melody. One whispered softly to the others, careful not to break the spell. "She's making something so simple feel alive." They were right. The young woman had taken a simple request and transformed it, not with flash or spectacle, but with quiet skill and deep understanding. Every note had purpose, every phrase told a story. The listeners were no longer passive. They were part of the unfolding narrative, each absorbing it in their own way. The young woman noticed a subtle shift in her own heart. Playing in small cafes had always been her way of connecting with people, but moments like this reminded her how fragile and beautiful those connections could be. She had a sense that something was about to unfold, something beyond what she had anticipated. She allowed herself to explore, to follow the instincts that had guided her fingers for years. The melody began to expand, taking on layers that hinted at emotions not yet named, feelings that were waiting to be discovered in the quiet spaces between the notes. The cafe's atmosphere was charged with a gentle energy. Conversations had ceased entirely, the usual clatter of cups and movement replaced by a collective stillness. Even the barista, busy with orders earlier, now leaned on the counter, captivated. The young woman could feel the subtle reactions in the room, the shared understanding that something rare was happening. She did not need to see every face. She could sense the attention, the curiosity, the quiet awe. It was a connection that required no words, only presence, only openness. She began to weave a secondary line into the melody, a gentle counterpoint that danced alongside the main tune. It added depth, complexity, and a sense of movement without disrupting the flow. The notes intertwined, creating a delicate conversation within the music itself. The audience, though unaware of the technical aspects, felt the effect instinctively. It was as if the music were alive, breathing and evolving with them. They followed its twists and turns with a quiet anticipation, eager for each new note, each gentle surprise. The young woman played with a sense of freedom she rarely allowed herself in public spaces. Normally she held back, careful not to overwhelm or dominate, but now, feeling the room's response, she let the music stretch, bend, and expand. There was no fear, no concern for judgment, only the quiet joy of creation, the thrill of knowing that something meaningful was unfolding. The melody, simple in intention, had become a living story, one that grew organically with every movement of her hands. A man sitting alone near the entrance rested his chin on his hand, captivated. He had walked in distracted, thinking of errands and obligations, but now he was entirely absorbed. Memories surfaced. Emotions he had tried to ignore bubbled to the surface. The music was gentle but insistent, coaxing him to feel, to notice, to remember. For a moment he let go of everything outside the cafe, surrendering to the quiet power of the performance. It was a rare gift, one that he did not take lightly. The young woman felt a subtle smile tug at her lips as she played. She could sense the shared experience, the quiet magic of the moment. Music, she realized, had a way of touching the deepest parts of people without them even knowing. It could stir emotions, awaken memories, and create connections that words could never achieve. She allowed herself to be carried by that understanding, letting the melody grow and expand in ways that felt natural yet surprising. She introduced small, unexpected pauses, moments of silence that allowed the notes to resonate more fully. Each pause was deliberate, a breath in the music, a space for the listeners to absorb what had just been played. The effect was subtle but profound. People leaned in, eyes closing briefly to savor the sound, to feel its impact more fully. The cafe was alive with attention, not loud or chaotic, but quiet, focused, and deeply engaged. Her hands moved effortlessly across the keys, yet there was a tension beneath the surface, a careful balance between control and freedom. She was guiding the melody but not constraining it. The notes flowed naturally, responding to her intentions while leaving room for spontaneity. It was a delicate dance, one that required complete presence and trust in the music itself. She had learned this over years of practice, over countless small performances where subtlety mattered more than showmanship. Outside, the world continued its usual pace, unaware of the transformation occurring inside the cafe. But within, something rare and beautiful had taken shape. The young woman's performance had begun as a simple request, yet it had evolved into a shared experience, a quiet journey that connected everyone present. It was a reminder that even ordinary spaces and moments could become extraordinary when approached with care, presence, and openness. As the melody reached a gentle climax, she allowed herself a brief pause to feel the energy in the room. The audience was completely engaged, leaning forward, their expressions softened, their attention unwavering. The music had captured them, not with grandeur or spectacle, but with honesty, emotion, and the quiet beauty of skillful expression. She could feel the room holding its collective breath, waiting for the next note, the next turn in the unfolding story. Finally, she allowed the melody to settle, returning to a simple, gentle refrain that echoed the beginning. The notes lingered, soft and warm, like a sigh shared between performer and audience. There was a brief, delicate silence, a pause that felt meaningful before the young woman took a deep breath and let her fingers hover above the keys once more. She could feel the energy in the cafe shifting, a quiet anticipation filling the room. The earlier parts of her performance had already captured the attention of everyone present, but she felt that something more was emerging, a deeper connection that had yet to reveal itself. She leaned slightly forward, focusing entirely on the keys beneath her hands, feeling the subtle vibrations and the soft resonance of the piano. As she began to play, the simple melody she had started with transformed again. It grew richer, more complex, yet remained gentle, inviting the audience to follow along without overwhelming them. Her fingers danced across the keys with precision, each movement thoughtful, deliberate, and full of emotion. The notes flowed like a stream, sometimes quiet and reflective, sometimes rising with gentle excitement, always maintaining a natural, human rhythm. A man sitting near the corner had been quietly observing since the beginning. He had come into the cafe expecting only a moment of background music, a light distraction from his day. But now, as the young woman's hands moved gracefully, he felt a stirring inside himself he couldn't explain. Memories of his own childhood, moments long forgotten, and dreams that had been set aside began to surface. He realized he was not just listening. He was living in the music, letting it guide his thoughts and emotions without even realizing it. The young woman added subtle layers to the melody, small flourishes that enriched the original tune without taking away from its simplicity. Her hands moved with a fluidity that seemed almost effortless, yet there was a quiet strength in every touch. She was aware of the audience, sensing their reactions through tiny gestures. The tilt of a head, the soft closing of eyes, the gentle nods that acknowledged the connection they were feeling. These unspoken signals encouraged her, reminding her of the power of shared presence. A mother sitting with her young daughter leaned forward slightly, holding the child close. The little girl's eyes were wide with wonder, following the movement of the pianist's fingers. She whispered something softly to her mother, who smiled, understanding the sentiment. The mother had been carrying worries all day, small stresses and larger uncertainties, but now, in this moment, all of that seemed distant. The music offered a gentle release, a reminder that beauty could exist even in small, ordinary moments. The melody began to rise and fall with greater subtlety, a gentle ebb and flow that mirrored the natural rhythms of life. The young woman allowed herself to explore this rhythm, following the instinctive pulse of her own emotions and the collective energy of the room. She introduced quiet pauses, spaces between notes that allowed the listeners to absorb the music fully, to feel its impact more deeply. Each pause was like a soft breath shared with the audience, a moment of reflection within the unfolding story. From across the room, an elderly man leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on his knees. He had spent many years listening to music, attending concerts, and playing an instrument himself. But there was something unique about this performance. The young woman's approach was gentle yet profound, her understanding of sound and emotion evident in every note. He felt a quiet joy, a sense of being reminded why music mattered so much, why it could touch the heart in ways that words alone never could. The young woman began to weave a second, more intricate line into the melody. It intertwined with the original tune, creating a delicate counterpoint that added depth and texture. The notes danced around each other, not in competition but in harmony, forming a dialogue that was subtle yet powerful. The audience felt this instinctively. Though they could not name the technical aspects, they sensed the complexity, the beauty, and the intention behind every movement of her hands. A young couple sitting near the window held hands lightly, their fingers intertwined as they listened. Neither spoke, both captivated by the gentle evolution of the melody. The music seemed to reflect their own shared experiences, the quiet laughter, the challenges faced together, the unspoken understanding that existed between them. In that moment, the piano became a mirror, reflecting not just the young woman's emotions, but those of everyone present. Outside, the afternoon sunlight had softened, creating long, warm shadows across the cafe floor. Dust particles floated lazily in the light, catching briefly on each note as it resonated in the space. The young woman noticed these details, though she did not pause to dwell on them. Instead, she allowed them to become part of the performance, subtle touches that added to the immersive experience. Every sound, every movement, every small shift in the room was part of the living story she was telling. The melody grew bolder, rising with gentle intensity yet never losing its intimacy. The young woman felt a quiet thrill as she played, a recognition that the music was unfolding in a way that no one, perhaps even she herself, could have anticipated. Each note carried emotion, each phrase told a story, and every listener was caught within that story, experiencing it uniquely but collectively. There was a beauty in this shared understanding, a silent communication that transcended words. The cafe had become a sanctuary, a space where time seemed to slow. Patrons who had arrived stressed, distracted, or indifferent were now fully present, absorbed in the unfolding music. Conversations and concerns were temporarily set aside. The young woman's playing had created a shared moment of attention and reflection, a quiet miracle within the ordinary walls of the cafe. People were not just hearing, they were feeling, thinking, remembering, and connecting. She introduced a subtle change in rhythm, a gentle sway that made the melody dance lightly. The notes moved like ripples across a calm surface, delicate yet persistent, drawing listeners into the music's flow. The audience responded instinctively. Shoulders relaxed, brows unfurrowed, eyes closed briefly, hearts opened. Even those who had initially approached the performance casually found themselves fully engaged, unable to look away from the piano or stop listening to the story unfolding through sound. A young man who had been sitting quietly in the back now leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, eyes fixed on the pianist. He had not expected to feel so moved by a simple melody, yet he found himself drawn into every note, every nuance, every small, unexpected turn in the music. He realized that he was experiencing something rare, something that went beyond mere listening, a quiet intimacy that connected him to the performer and to everyone else in the room. The young woman felt her own emotions deepen as she continued. The melody, simple in its beginning, had transformed into something layered, expressive, and deeply human. She allowed herself to explore the full range of feeling within the music, from gentle melancholy to soft joy, from quiet reflection to subtle excitement. Each note was carefully chosen, every pause meaningful, and the cumulative effect was a tapestry of sound that enveloped the audience completely. The cafe's atmosphere shifted subtly yet unmistakably. Even the barista, who had been moving between orders and drinks, now leaned on the counter listening with rapt attention. She noticed the reactions of others around her, the way faces softened, the gentle nods, the quiet expressions of awe. The music had created an invisible bond, uniting everyone in shared attention and emotional resonance. The young woman began to play with greater confidence, her fingers moving faster yet remaining fluid and precise. The melody took on a new dimension, a sense of motion and evolution that felt inevitable. Each chord seemed to speak, each phrase a gentle conversation. The audience responded with subtle, unconscious gestures. A slight lean forward, a soft intake of breath, a whispered acknowledgement. These small reactions were her reward, proof that the music was reaching its intended destination. As the performance progressed, the young woman allowed moments of silence to punctuate the melody, creating tension and anticipation. These pauses were deliberate, giving the listeners space to reflect, to absorb, to become part of the music themselves. The effect was profound. Every person in the room felt the music not just as sound but as an emotional experience, a personal journey guided by the pianist's touch. She returned to the original melody, weaving it into the more complex layers she had developed. The familiar tune now felt richer, fuller, transformed by the subtle nuances and embellishments she had introduced. The audience recognized the simple theme, yet they also felt the depth added by her interpretation. It was a delicate balance, honoring the request while transcending it, and she achieved it effortlessly, as if the music itself were guiding her hands. By now, the cafe was completely absorbed. No one spoke, no one moved unnecessarily. Patrons had become participants in the performance, experiencing a moment that existed outside the ordinary flow of life. Each listener carried their own thoughts, memories, and emotions, yet all were connected through the shared experience. The young woman sensed this connection, a silent thread linking her to every person present, and it inspired her to continue, to explore even deeper emotional terrain. The final notes of this segment began to emerge naturally, softening, descending gently like the fading light outside the windows. She allowed the melody to linger, each note stretching just long enough to leave a quiet resonance in the air. The audience remained still, absorbing the subtle beauty of what had just occurred. The young woman felt a subtle thrill as she returned to the piano for the next part of her performance. The room was alive with quiet anticipation, every listener already captured by the journey so far. She didn't need to look around. She could feel the attention, the collective focus, the invisible threads connecting her to each person in the cafe. The first parts of the melody had prepared them, but now it was time to reveal more, to let the music take on a life of its own. Her fingers touched the keys gently, producing notes that were soft yet clear. The melody began simply, recalling the tune she had been asked to play, but she allowed it to grow naturally, introducing subtle variations and intricate harmonies. Every chord was intentional, chosen not for show but for its ability to convey emotion. The young woman was fully present, listening to the resonance of each note and the responses of the audience, letting the music and the room guide her. A man seated at a small table near the center of the cafe leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the edge. He had come in expecting a quiet background melody, something soft to accompany his afternoon. But now he found himself completely absorbed. His eyes followed the pianist's hands, but he was not just watching. He was feeling the music in his chest, in his heart, in a way that reminded him of moments he had thought were lost. The melody stirred memories of laughter, of gentle afternoons spent with friends, of quiet moments of reflection. Each note resonated deeply, creating a personal connection he could not explain. The young woman's hands moved with grace, her fingers dancing across the keys, weaving complex yet gentle patterns that complemented the main melody. The music began to build slowly, each phrase layering upon the last, creating a tapestry of sound that filled the cafe completely. She introduced slight pauses, allowing the notes to linger in the air, giving the audience time to breathe with the music, to absorb it fully. These moments of silence were as important as the notes themselves, providing contrast and depth, and inviting everyone to enter the emotional world she was creating. A mother sitting near the back with her small child watched silently. The little girl's eyes were wide with fascination, and she gently tapped her fingers on the table in rhythm with the music. The mother smiled softly, feeling a sense of calm wash over her that she hadn't experienced in days. The music allowed her to step outside her routine, to breathe, and to share a quiet moment with her child that felt almost sacred. For a brief while, the weight of her responsibilities lifted, replaced by the gentle joy of shared presence. The young woman began to introduce more intricate chords, her fingers moving faster yet without haste. The melody, once simple and expected, now took on unexpected richness. It was as if the piano itself had joined in the conversation, each note responding to the last, creating layers of sound that were subtle but profound. The audience felt this transformation, though they might not have understood its technical complexity. They responded instinctively, leaning in, closing their eyes, letting the music wash over them. An older man who had been listening quietly from a corner now sat up straighter, captivated. He had spent decades around music, attending concerts and performances. But there was something extraordinary about this moment. The young woman's playing was not about virtuosity alone, but about emotion, about storytelling, about connecting with every person in the room. He felt a rare joy, a quiet recognition of the power music held, and he realized that he was witnessing something special, something that would stay with him long after the notes faded. The melody began to swell, rising and falling with gentle intensity. The young woman allowed herself to explore new directions, adding subtle flourishes and variations that enriched the experience. Every note seemed deliberate yet effortless, conveying a depth of feeling that words could never capture. The cafe felt transformed, no longer just a place for coffee and conversation, but a space suspended in time, where the ordinary became extraordinary through sound and presence. A young couple near the window leaned closer together, holding hands lightly as they listened. Neither spoke, yet they communicated silently through the shared experience of the music. Each note seemed to echo the rhythm of their own lives, reflecting small joys and quiet sorrows, unspoken thoughts and tender feelings. The piano had become a mirror, revealing emotions and connections that existed quietly between them, now made visible through sound. The young woman noticed a shift within herself as she played. She had always known music could move people, but moments like this reminded her of its subtle, transformative power. She felt a quiet joy, a deep satisfaction, in being able to reach each listener, to touch their hearts in ways that were gentle but profound. She did not seek recognition or applause. The act of sharing, of creating something meaningful, was reward enough. Her hands moved across the keys with growing confidence, exploring dynamic contrasts and gentle rhythms that carried the melody forward. The music began to weave a story, one that was both universal and deeply personal. Each phrase carried meaning, each pause invited reflection, and each note resonated with emotion. The audience was fully engaged, absorbed in the experience, their attention unwavering. The cafe had become a living organism, its energy shaped by the music, the presence of the listeners, and the quiet intensity of the pianist. A young man who had been sitting quietly near the back now leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, completely captivated. He had expected only a simple tune, but what he experienced was far beyond that. The music stirred feelings he had kept hidden, longings he had set aside, and hopes he had almost forgotten. He felt connected, not only to the pianist but to the other listeners, sharing in a moment that was private yet collective, intimate yet universal. The young woman introduced a delicate counterpoint, adding depth and texture to the main melody. The notes intertwined in a conversation of their own, creating an intricate tapestry of sound. The audience, whether aware of the technical details or not, felt the effect deeply. The music seemed to speak directly to them, conveying emotions, memories, and connections that transcended words. It was a reminder of how powerful music could be when played with understanding, intention, and heart. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted completely. Patrons who had entered casually, expecting nothing more than a background tune, were now fully engaged. The air was filled with a sense of anticipation and quiet reverence, a shared acknowledgement that something special was happening. The young woman could sense the subtle changes in posture, the soft smiles, the moments of introspection. Every listener had become part of the unfolding story, each responding in their own way, yet all connected through the music. She played with a mixture of restraint and freedom, allowing the melody to grow organically. Each note was deliberate, each phrase carefully shaped, yet there was room for spontaneity, for emotion to guide the performance naturally. The music took on a richness that was unexpected even to her, and she allowed herself to follow where it led, trusting in the instinct that had carried her through countless performances before. A mother and her daughter sat quietly, their attention fully on the piano. The young girl's eyes were wide with wonder, and she whispered to her mother, pointing to the pianist's hands. The mother smiled, feeling the beauty of the moment and the shared connection. For them, the music was more than notes. It was a story, an experience, a memory in the making. The young woman at the piano had transformed a simple request into something that touched their hearts profoundly. The melody began to build, rising with gentle intensity, creating a sense of movement and progression. The young woman allowed the music to reach its emotional peak, guiding the audience through a journey that was at once personal and collective. Each chord resonated in the room, every note a thread weaving the listeners together in shared experience. The cafe seemed to hold its breath, waiting, absorbing, participating in the unfolding story. Finally, the young woman brought the melody back to its original theme, now enriched by the variations and layers she had added. The familiar tune felt transformed, fuller, more expressive, carrying the weight of the journey they had all shared. She allowed the final notes to linger, soft and gentle, creating a quiet space for the audience to reflect, to breathe, to absorb the beauty of the moment. As the last sound faded, the cafe remained silent for a heartbeat, a collective pause that spoke volumes. The young woman lifted her hands from the keys, letting the final echo settle completely. Eyes opened, expressions softened, and a quiet sense of awe filled the room. People looked at each other, silently acknowledging what had just occurred, a shared understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The young woman smiled softly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had taken a simple request, something seemingly ordinary, and transformed it into a moment of connection, emotion, and beauty. She did not need applause or recognition. The experience itself was enough. The cafe, once filled with ordinary sounds and movements, now carried a lingering resonance of music and emotion, a memory that would remain with everyone present for a long time. And in that quiet, human moment, the young woman at the piano knew she had shared something profoundly meaningful, a gift of music that transcended words and touched hearts. The young woman sat for a moment, letting the final notes of her performance fade completely. The cafe was silent, filled with a quiet that felt almost sacred. People remained seated, still absorbing the music, their expressions soft, thoughtful, and moved. She lifted her hands from the keys and rested them gently in her lap, breathing slowly, feeling the warmth and calm that had settled over the room. This was more than a performance. It was a shared experience, a moment suspended in time. Slowly, the audience began to stir. Soft murmurs of appreciation rose, quiet nods and gentle smiles spreading across faces. No one rushed to clap, as if unsure whether to interrupt the lingering magic, yet the energy of gratitude and admiration was unmistakable. The young woman smiled faintly, not seeking recognition but feeling quietly satisfied that the music had reached them. She had shared a piece of herself, and they had received it fully. A man at a corner table who had been sitting with his head slightly bowed, now straightened, eyes glistening with emotion. He reached into his bag and took out a small notebook, quickly scribbling something as though wanting to capture a fragment of what he had felt. Others leaned back, exchanging glances, whispers of appreciation passing between them. Some spoke softly about how moving the performance had been, how a simple melody had transformed into something far beyond their expectations. The young woman took a gentle breath and looked around the cafe. Her gaze met those of people who had been quietly absorbing the music, and a sense of connection passed silently between them. She noticed the barista standing still behind the counter, her usual energetic movements halted as she absorbed the lingering sound and the effect it had had on the room. Even those who had been distracted at the start were now fully present, their faces softened and reflective, carrying the weight of emotion that music had awakened. She allowed herself a small smile. This was what she loved about playing, the ability to touch lives without words, to create a quiet moment of reflection, beauty, and shared humanity. The piano was not just an instrument. It was a bridge, a medium through which she could communicate and connect, a way to speak to people's hearts when words alone were never enough. From a corner table, a young couple approached her slowly. They had been quiet throughout the performance, their hands gently intertwined, eyes wide with emotion. The woman spoke first, her voice hushed but full of warmth. "That was incredible. We didn't expect it to be so moving." The young woman simply nodded, her humility evident, but her heart felt light knowing her music had touched them. The man added softly, "You have a gift. We've never heard anything like that before." The cafe owner, who had been observing quietly from the back, stepped forward as well. She approached carefully, not wanting to disturb the fragile magic of the moment. "Thank you," she said softly. "You've brought something truly special here today. Everyone is talking about it, even those who didn't know what to expect. You've turned a simple melody into something unforgettable." The young woman acknowledged the praise with a modest smile, her eyes reflecting a quiet pride and satisfaction. She had not sought fame, but this recognition felt different, personal, genuine, and heartfelt. Slowly, other patrons began to speak up, expressing their gratitude and admiration. A woman near the window, clutching her book, said softly, "I came in expecting nothing, just a little background music, and instead, I felt something I can't explain. It was beautiful." A man seated at a nearby table nodded in agreement, adding, "It felt like the music spoke directly to me, like it knew things about my day, my thoughts. It was extraordinary." Each comment reinforced the quiet but undeniable impact she had made. The cafe was no longer just a place for coffee. It had become a space where lives had been touched, where hearts had opened briefly but meaningfully. The young woman returned her gaze to the piano, her fingers brushing the keys lightly. She had shared something deep, and the energy of the room reflected it. She realized that her music had created a ripple, a subtle transformation in each person present. Even though the performance had ended, its effects lingered. People were more aware, more present, carrying the resonance of emotion within them. The cafe itself seemed different, softer, warmer, more alive. A young man who had been quietly observing from the back now stood, moving closer to the piano. He looked at her, hesitation in his eyes, and then asked, "Do you play often? People need to hear this more often. You're extraordinary." The young woman smiled gently, appreciating his enthusiasm but remaining humble. She did not play for fame or attention. She played for connection, for the subtle moments that allowed people to feel, to reflect, to share quietly in the language of music. The atmosphere in the cafe was one of gentle reverence. People lingered longer than usual, savoring the calm after the music, reluctant to break the spell. The young woman noticed that some had taken out their phones, not for distraction, but to capture small videos, wanting to hold on to the memory of what they had experienced. Yet even these recordings could not contain the depth of feeling that had passed between performer and audience. It was something intangible, alive, existing in that space and moment alone. She allowed herself a deep, steady breath, appreciating the stillness. This was the culmination of what she had wanted to give, a quiet but profound gift that resonated in each person. The simple melody she had been asked to play had become a bridge to something larger, a gentle reminder of the beauty and connection that existed even in ordinary life. The music had spoken where words could not, leaving behind a sense of wonder, reflection, and quiet joy. The cafe owner returned, this time holding a small envelope. "Please accept this," she said softly, placing it gently on the piano. "It's not much, but we want you to know how much your music means. You've given everyone here something extraordinary." The young woman's eyes softened. She had never sought payment or recognition, yet she felt grateful for the acknowledgement, a quiet affirmation that her gift had been received and cherished. Patrons slowly began to leave, but each step was quieter, more deliberate. Conversations resumed softly, yet the tone had shifted. There was a lingering sense of peace, a reflection of the shared experience they had just been part of. People left with a memory, a feeling, an unspoken understanding of something beautiful that had unfolded before them. The young woman watched them go, her heart full of quiet satisfaction and gentle pride. She stayed at the piano for a while longer, letting the calm of the room settle around her. The notes that remained in her mind were soft, echoes of the performance, reminders of the connection she had created. She knew that this experience would stay with her as well, a quiet affirmation of why she played, why she devoted her life to music, and why she sought these small, intimate spaces where the heart of her gift could be shared. The sunlight outside began to fade, casting long golden shadows across the cafe floor. She closed her eyes briefly, savoring the lingering resonance of the piano and the emotions that had filled the room. It was a quiet ending, not dramatic but deeply satisfying. She had taken a simple request and transformed it into something meaningful, something alive, something that had touched people's hearts in ways that would remain long after the day ended. Finally, she gathered her belongings, placing her sheet music carefully into her worn leather bag. She stood, giving the piano a soft pat of appreciation, a silent thanks for the instrument that had allowed her to communicate so fully. As she moved toward the door, she looked back at the cafe one last time. The faces she had seen, the subtle smiles, the soft whispers of appreciation, they would remain in her memory, reminders of the quiet power of music and human connection. The door opened, letting in a cool evening breeze, and she stepped out, feeling the calm satisfaction of a gift shared and received. She knew that wherever she went next, the memory of this afternoon, the energy of the cafe and the connection she had created would linger with her, guiding her fingers, her music, and her heart. She walked down the street, carrying the quiet joy of having transformed a simple request into something unforgettable, leaving behind a space that had been touched, however briefly, by her hidden genius.